The Laziness That Changed the War, May 22nd, 1940, Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, Northern Germany, 05:47 hours. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter sat hunched over his Enigma machine in the dimly lit communications room, the smell of stale cigarette smoke clinging to his grey Wehrmacht uniform. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, exhausted from the night shift that would end in 13 minutes. Outside the concrete bunker, the first threads of dawn crept across the North Sea, but inside, only the yellow glow of a single overhead bulb illuminated his workstation. The machine before him, a Type 1 Enigma, with its 3 rotors visible through the wooden casing, waited for him to select the message key that would encrypt today's first transmission to U-boat command. The daily key settings had been distributed at midnight. Rotor order 25, ring settings 06, 1807, plugboard connections that transformed 10 pairs of letters. Richter had already configured these settings, his practiced hands moving through the ritual he'd performed hundreds of times. But now came the operator's choice, the 3-letter message key that he would select randomly, type twice, and transmit at the beginning of his encoded message. 3 letters. Completely random. Different for every message. That was the protocol. Richter's eyelids felt like lead. He had been on duty for 7 hours, processing routine weather reports and supply requisitions. The messages blurred together in his mind. His fiancée, Cillies' last letter, sat folded in his breast pocket. He'd read it during his break, her handwriting a reminder of home in Hamburg, of a life that existed beyond encrypted messages and the mechanical clicking of Enigma rotors. He glanced at the message form before him, another weather report from reconnaissance aircraft over the North Atlantic. Routine, meaningless, but requiring encryption nonetheless. 3 random letters, any 3 letters. His fingers drifted to the keyboard. CIL. He typed them without thinking, muscle memory guided by exhaustion and sentiment. Cillies' initials. The rotors spun, the plugboard redirected current, and the lamp board illuminated 3 different letters that he dutifully wrote down. He typed CIL again, the double encryption required by protocol, and recorded the second trio of illuminated letters. Then he reset the rotors to CIL and began encoding the actual weather message, each keystroke advancing the rightmost rotor 1 position, the mechanical complexity of the Enigma machine transforming his mundane report into an impenetrable jumble of letters, or so he believed. 600 miles west, the radio signal transmitted from Wilhelmshaven crackled through the headphones of a WAF operator at a Y station on the British coast. Her pencil moved rapidly, transcribing the incomprehensible string of letters onto a standardized form. She noted the call signs, the frequency, the time of interception. Within the hour, a dispatch rider would collect her intercepts along with dozens of others and speed toward Bletchley Park, the Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, where Britain's cryptanalysts waged their invisible war against German ciphers. Richter finished his transmission, logged it in his duty book, and stretched his arms above his head. 12 minutes until relief. He lit another cigarette and stared at the concrete wall. He didn't know that he had just made a mistake. A small mistake. A human mistake. The kind of shortcut that tired men make when they believe no one is watching, when they convince themselves that one tiny deviation from protocol couldn't possibly matter in the grand scheme of a continental war. He certainly didn't know that this same shortcut, this same tired impulse to choose familiar letters instead of random ones, was being made by dozens of other German Enigma operators across Europe at that very moment. Some typed their girlfriend's initials. Others typed sequential letters from the keyboard, ABC or QWE or DEF. Some typed the same 3 letters they'd used yesterday or the day before because they couldn't remember if they'd used them already, and it was easier than trying to generate true randomness in their exhausted minds. The machines were unbreakable. The experts had promised them that. The mathematical permutations numbered in the billions. The British couldn't possibly decrypt their messages. So what did it matter if he chose CIL one more time? What harm could 3 little letters do? In Hut 6 at Bletchley Park, where wooden walls enclosed the beating heart of British code-breaking operations, a 23-year-old woman named Sarah Watkins was about to find out. Inside the routine Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England, May 22, 1940, 14:20 hours. Sarah Watkins pushed through the door of Hut 6, carrying a cardboard folder stuffed with intercept forms, the afternoon sun momentarily blinding her after 2 hours in the index room. The wooden hut, hastily constructed 18 months earlier when war became inevitable, had never been designed for the organized chaos it now contained. 27 people worked at tables arranged in rough rows, their voices creating a constant murmur beneath the clacking of typewriters and the shuffle of paper. Cigarette smoke formed a grey haze near the ceiling, and the air smelled of strong tea, damp wood, and the peculiar electrical odour of the Typex machines that lined the far wall. She navigated past Stuart Milner Barry, who was hunched over a worksheet covered in German letters, muttering to himself about rota positions. Past Joan Clark at the big room tables, her keen eyes scanning columns of letter pairs for patterns that might indicate a crib, a guessed plaintext phrase that could unlock an entire day's worth of German communications. Past Gordon Welchman's office, where the Hut 6 chief was briefing 2 Navy intelligence officers on yesterday's U-boat decrypts. Sarah's station was in the corner, designated for what Dilly Knox, in his characteristically dramatic fashion, had labelled the Cillies hunt. Knox himself, brilliant, eccentric, dying slowly from stomach cancer, though few knew it yet, had coined the term months earlier after Polish cryptanalysts mentioned that one Wehrmacht operator seemed fond of using CIL as a message key. The name had stuck, evolving from one man's sentimental choice into a designation for an entire category of operator weakness. She dropped the folder on her desk and sat down, pulling out the first intercept form. The message had been captured at 062 hours by Y Station Scarborough, a Luftwaffe transmission from northern France, call signs indicating it originated from a reconnaissance unit. The first 6 letters of the encrypted message represented the doubly enciphered message key, the operator's supposedly random 3-letter choice, encrypted twice using the day's settings. Sarah had been doing this work for 11 months now, ever since she'd been recruited from Oxford, where she'd been studying German literature. She'd arrived at Bletchley expecting to translate documents. Instead, after a brief interview that tested her puzzle-solving abilities more than her language skills, she'd been assigned to Hut 6 and given a crash course in cryptanalysis. The work was tedious, meticulous, and occasionally mind-numbing. It was also, she'd discovered, addictive. The challenge was this: German Enigma operators were supposed to choose their message keys randomly. 3 letters from the 26-letter alphabet, giving 17,576 possible combinations. But humans, particularly tired, bored, or lazy humans, were terrible at generating randomness. They fell into patterns. They chose letters that meant something to them, or letters that were easy to type, or, most helpfully from a cryptanalyst's perspective, letters they'd used before. Sarah had developed an instinct for it. She maintained a card index of suspected Cillies, organized by German units and individual operator signatures when she could identify them. She knew that the operator working morning shifts for Luftflotte 3's weather reconnaissance often used QWE, 3 consecutive letters on the German keyboard layout. She knew that someone in the 7th Panzer Division's communications section had a fondness for ALE or BBB, the same letter repeated 3 times, which was lazy even by Cillie standards. She knew that on Mondays, after weekend leave, operators were more likely to use predictable keys, their minds still fuzzy from rest or recreation. She examined the intercept before her. The first 6 encrypted letters were PJXLQM, Somewhere beneath that encryption lay the operator's choice, encrypted twice. If she could guess that choice, if this operator was using a Cillie, she could potentially work backward through the mathematics of the Enigma machine to determine parts of the daily key settings. Not the complete settings. That would require the bomb machines that were still being built and tested. But enough information to narrow the possibilities, to give the senior cryptanalysts a starting point, to transform an impossible problem into merely a difficult one. She pulled out her worksheet and began the systematic process of testing common Cillies against this message. ABC, BCD, CDE, keyboard sequences, AAA, BBB, CCC, repeating letters. Then, the initials she'd flagged in her index as possibilities for this unit based on previous intercepts. She worked through each possibility, applying the mathematical transformation she'd been taught, checking whether the results produced letter patterns consistent with German plain text. 35 minutes later, after testing 47 different Cillies, her pencil stopped. HJL, consecutive letters but starting from H rather than the usual A or Q. She ran the calculation twice more to be certain, her pulse quickening. The first 6 letters of the message decrypted to HJL when she assumed the operator had used HJL as the message key. The double encryption matched. She'd found it. Sarah stood quickly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. This wasn't just an identified Cillie. This was fresh information she could pass to the senior team working on today's Luftwaffe key. If they could confirm her finding against other messages from the same network, if they could find more Cillies or cribs that corroborated, they might break into today's traffic before sunset. She caught Gordon Welchman's eye across the room and held up her worksheet. He nodded and gestured for her to approach. As she wove between the tables toward his office, Sarah felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that made the long hours, the secrecy, the smoky air and aching eyes worthwhile. Somewhere in occupied France, a tired German operator had taken a shortcut, had chosen letters that seemed random enough, had trusted that the mathematical fortress of Enigma would protect his laziness. He had been wrong. And in 3 hours, the Luftwaffe reconnaissance reports he'd encrypted would be on their way to British Bomber Command, revealing German patrol patterns and defensive positions along the Channel coast. Information that would save British lives. Information extracted from 6 letters at the beginning of a routine weather transmission, all because someone had been too tired, too bored, or too confident to choose truly random keys. The Discovery Bletchley Park Cottage Workshop. December 8th, 1939. 15:30 hours. Dilly Knox sat in the small, cramped office he'd claimed as his personal research space, surrounded by papers that would have looked like chaos to anyone else, but represented perfect logical order to him. At 57, with his health failing and his legendary cryptanalytic career entering what he privately suspected would be its final chapter, Knox had become obsessed with the Enigma machine in a way that worried his colleagues and frustrated his superiors. The machine itself sat on his desk, not an actual German military Enigma, but the commercial version that had been available before the war, modified with intelligence information passed from the Polish Cipher Bureau before the German invasion. Knox had spent months studying its internal wiring, mapping the electrical pathways through rotors and reflectors, searching for any weakness he could exploit. The Poles had achieved brilliant early successes against Enigma, but the Germans had changed their procedures in September, rendering the Polish methods obsolete. Now British cryptanalysts were essentially starting from scratch. Knox's genius had always been his ability to think like his opponents, not just to understand the mathematics of a cipher, but to grasp the human psychology behind its use. Machines didn't make mistakes. People did. And somewhere in the German military's elaborate Enigma procedures, Knox was convinced people were making mistakes. Mavis Lever entered the office carrying tea and a folder of intercepts. At 19, Fresh from University College London, where she'd been studying German, she represented the wave of young recruits that Bletchley was desperately trying to train. Knox had taken an immediate liking to her sharp mind and willingness to question assumptions. "Hello, we're breaking machines," he'd told her on her first day, handing her a pencil. "Have you got a pencil? Here, have a go." "I've been reviewing the Italian intercepts like you asked," Mavis said, setting down the tea and opening her folder. The British had been capturing Italian naval Enigma messages since early November, and while the Italian machine used different rotors than the German military versions, Knox believed it might offer insights into operator behavior. "Find anything interesting?" Knox asked without looking up from the rotor wiring diagram he was sketching. "Patterns in the message keys," Mavis replied. She spread several intercept forms across the only clear space on his desk. "Look at these 6 messages from the same Italian naval unit, all transmitted on December 4th. The operators are supposed to choose random 3-letter keys, but 3 of them used sequential keyboard letters, RST, QWE, and TYU. And this one," she pointed to another form, "used the same key MNO that appears in 2 messages from December 2nd. Knox's head snapped up, his tired eyes suddenly alert. "Show me." For the next 20 minutes, Mavis walked him through her analysis. She'd organized the Italian intercepts by transmitting unit and had begun tracking which message keys appeared repeatedly or followed predictable patterns. The results were striking. Nearly 30% of the Italian operators were using some form of predictable key choice, sequential letters, repeated letters, keys that were reused across multiple days. "They're being lazy," Knox said softly, a smile spreading across his face. "They're supposed to generate random keys, but random is difficult. Random requires mental effort, so they're taking shortcuts." "Is this useful?" Mavis asked. "I mean, we still don't know the daily settings, the rotor orders and ring positions and plugboard connections. Even if we can guess their message key, doesn't that just tell us how they encrypted 6 letters? Knox stood and began pacing, his mind racing. No, you're missing the beauty of it. Look, the German procedure requires operators to encrypt their chosen message key twice using the day's settings. So if an operator chooses ABC, they type ABC twice, and the machine produces 6 encrypted letters, say QFXMTP. Those 6 letters are encrypted using the same rotor positions. That creates a relationship, a mathematical relationship, between the 1st and 4th letters, between the 2nd and 5th, between the 3rd and 6th. He grabbed a piece of paper and began sketching. If we can guess the message key, if we know an operator chose ABC, then we know that Q encrypts to A, F encrypts to B, and X encrypts to C, all with the rotors in their starting positions. That's a crib, a known plaintext. And if we collect enough of these cribs from different messages, we can start to reverse engineer the rotor settings." Mavis studied the diagram. "But we'd need multiple messages with predictable keys. We'd need enough data to narrow down the billions of possible settings." "Exactly, which is why your discovery is crucial." Knox returned to the intercepts spread across his desk. If Italian operators are being this lazy, German operators probably are too. They're human. They're tired. They're processing hundreds of messages daily. They're going to take shortcuts. He looked up at her. "We need to catalog this. Every German intercept we have. Look for patterns, sequential keys, repeated keys, personal initials, anything that deviates from true randomness." Personal initials?" Mavis asked. Knox picked up one of the Italian forms she'd marked. "This one, CIL. You flagged it because the same operator used it 3 times in 1 week. What if CIL is someone's initials? A girlfriend, a wife, a family member? Something personally meaningful that helps the operator remember they've completed this step of the procedure." He walked to the small window overlooking the grounds of Bletchley Park. Outside, winter rain fell steadily, and somewhere beyond the gardens, beyond the English countryside, across the channel, German operators were sitting at their Enigma machines, encrypting messages that could reveal U-boat positions, Wehrmacht movements, Luftwaffe operations. And some of those operators, tired or rushed or simply human, were choosing keys that weren't random at all. "We'll call them Cillies," Knox decided. "After your Italian who liked seal, make it official terminology." "And Mavis," he turned back to her, his expression serious, "this might be the opening we need. The Poles broke Enigma by exploiting the doubled key procedure. The Germans haven't changed that procedure yet, which means they don't realize it's vulnerable. If we can systematically identify Cillies and use them to generate cribs, we can feed those cribs into the bomb machines when they're ready. We can break Enigma not through mathematical brilliance alone, but through human weakness." Mavis gathered the intercepts, her mind already organizing the work ahead, creating a Cillie catalogue, training other analysts to recognize patterns, building an index system that could track operator habits across days and weeks. It would be tedious, painstaking work, testing thousands of messages against hundreds of possible predictable keys. But if Knox was right, if German operators were as human as Italian ones, then somewhere in those predictable patterns lay the weakness that could crack the uncrackable code. 3 letters, chosen carelessly, encrypted twice, the laziness that might change the war. Breaking the pattern. Bletchley Park, Hut 6 May 10th, 1940, 03:30 hours. The night shift in Hut 6 operated in a strange twilight world where time lost meaning and the only reality was encrypted letters and the endless search for patterns within chaos. John Monroe worked by the light of his desk lamp, his third cigarette of the hour burning in an overflowing ashtray, a cold cup of tea forgotten at his elbow. Around him, 24 other cryptanalysts maintained the vigil, their voices reduced to occasional whispers, the scratch of pencils on paper providing a constant rustle beneath the ticking of the wall clock. The Germans had changed everything on May 1st. For months, British cryptanalysts had relied on a method inherited from the Poles, perforated sheets that exploited the doubled message key procedure. It had been tedious, requiring the coordination of multiple analysts working through combinations, but it had worked often enough to provide intermittent access to German communications. Then, with the brutal efficiency that characterized German military administration, the procedure changed. The method of indicating message keys was modified, the vulnerability that the sheets exploited was closed, and overnight, Bletchley Park's primary technique for breaking Enigma became worthless. For 9 days, Hut 6 had been essentially blind to German Army and Air Force traffic. 9 days while Wehrmacht forces massed on the French border. 9 days while intelligence reports suggested an imminent invasion of the Low Countries. 9 days of intercepting thousands of encrypted messages that might contain crucial information about German plans, and being unable to read a single word. John worked through another message, testing it against his Cillie index. Since the procedure change, Cillies had become more important than ever. They were, effectively, one of the only remaining tools available. If an operator used a predictable message key, and if the cryptanalysts could guess it, they could generate a crib, a piece of known plaintext encrypted with unknown settings. Multiple cribs from different messages might provide enough information to deduce rotor positions, at least partially. It was a long shot, requiring both luck and systematic analysis, but long shots were all they had. This message had been intercepted at 01:47 hours from a Luftwaffe unit in western Germany. Standard traffic based on the call signs. Weather report or reconnaissance data, most likely. The kind of routine communication that filled 90% of German transmissions. John tested the first 6 encrypted letters against common Cillies: ABC, QWEE, AAA, DEF. Nothing. He continued through his list, checking each possibility methodically. His eyes burned. He'd been on shift since midnight, and the sun wouldn't rise for another 2 hours. Outside, spring rain pattered against the windows of the hut. Inside, The only war that mattered was the one fought with pencils and paper, and the stubborn refusal to accept that billions of permutations made a code truly unbreakable. LMN. He tested it mechanically, working through the mathematical transformations. The letters aligned. The doubled key structure matched. LMN, LMN. John sat up straighter, fatigue forgotten. He grabbed the message form and walked quickly to the supervisor's desk, where Peter Twin was coordinating the night shift efforts. "Got a Cillies on Luftwaffe Red," John said quietly, using the designation for this particular German communications network. Twin examined the worksheet, checking John's calculations. Strong confidence. High. Classic sequential pattern. LMN shows up in our index from 3 weeks ago, same network. Twin stood and moved to the large board mounted on the wall, where they tracked the progress on different German networks. Luftwaffe Red had been dark, no successful decryptions, since May 1st. He marked the board with the time and John's identified Cillies. "Keep hunting. We need at least 4 cribs before we can attempt a run on the settings." Over the next 2 hours, 2 more Cillies surfaced. Sarah Watkins found another sequential pattern, DF, in a message intercepted from occupied Poland. David Fletcher identified what appeared to be a personal initial pattern, EHW, that matched multiple previous intercepts from the same unit. By 0545 hours, they had 5 probable Cillies from Luftwaffe Red traffic, all from the current day, all providing cribs that could theoretically be used to work backward toward the daily settings. Twin gathered the senior analysts in the corner office. "We don't have the bomb machines operational yet," he said, referring to the electromechanical devices being designed to automate the testing of Enigma settings. "So we do this the old way, manual testing of rotor orders and positions based on the cribs we've identified. It's going to take hours, possibly all day." "We might not get there," Gordon Welchman added, entering the office with a fresh stack of intercepts. 5 cribs aren't many. But given the situation, he meant the looming German invasion that everyone knew was coming. "We have to try." The day shift arrived at 800 hours, and Twin briefed them on the night's progress. The tedious work of testing rotor combinations began, with teams of cryptanalysts systematically working through possibilities guided by the crib information from the identified Cillies. Each test required checking whether the assumed settings would produce the correct encryptions for the known plaintext fragments. Each failure meant moving to the next possibility. By noon, they'd eliminated 4,000 possible combinations. By 1500 hours, 8,000. The work was mind-numbing, mechanical, the kind of task that reduced brilliant university graduates to human calculating machines. But they persisted, driven by the knowledge that somewhere in this encrypted traffic might be information about German operational plans. At 1847 hours, Dennis Babbage at the testing table suddenly said, "Stop." The room fell quiet. "I have settings that work for all 5 messages," he said carefully, checking his calculations again. "Rotor order I23, ring settings 16 to 2608, plugboard pairs still unknown, but we can deduce them from the plaintexts if these settings are correct." Welchman crossed the room in 3 strides. "Test it against the full messages. Use standard Luftwaffe cribs for the content, Wetter for weather, Oberkommando for high command references." 15 minutes later, they had it. The daily settings for Luftwaffe Red, May 10th, 1940. Broken not through advanced machinery or mathematical breakthroughs, but through patient exploitation of operator laziness and systematic testing. The messages began yielding their secrets, weather reports, supply requisitions, and then, in a message transmitted at 0420 hours that morning, a single line that made Welchman reach immediately for the telephone to Hut 3, where intelligence analysts waited to process decrypted content. "Airborne operations scheduled dawn plus 2 hours, Fall Gelb execute, confirm receipt." Fall Gelb, case yellow, the code name for Germany's Western offensive. The invasion of France and the Low Countries had begun that morning. And thanks to a German operator who had chosen LMN as his message key instead of 3 truly random letters, British intelligence now had confirmation, late but better than nothing, from the enemy's own communications. Outside Hut 6, rain continued falling on the grounds of Bletchley Park. Inside, cryptanalysts were already working on the next day's keys, building their Cillies catalogues, refining their techniques. The war would last 5 more years. Enigma would evolve, become more complex, add fourth rotors and new procedures. But the human weakness at its heart, the tired operators choosing predictable keys, the shortcuts taken when no one seemed to be watching, would persist. 3 letters, chosen carelessly, breaking open an unbreakable code. The cost of confidence, North Atlantic, 300 miles west of Ireland, November 16th, 1942, 022 hours. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stood in the control room of U-6864, feeling the submarine roll gently in the Atlantic's swell. Around him, his crew moved with the quiet efficiency of men who'd spent months learning to function in the cramped, diesel-scented confines of a Type 7C U-boat. The radio operator Obergefreiter Paul Schmidt sat at his station adjusting the dials of the Enigma machine, preparing to transmit their position report to BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, U-boat command. This was Schmidt's 47th patrol, and the ritual had become automatic. Set the rotors according to the daily key distributed by headquarters. Configure the plugboard connections. Choose a 3-letter message key. Random, supposedly, though after 200 transmissions, Schmidt had developed habits he wasn't fully conscious of. Quick choices, easy choices, keys that his fingers found without thinking. He typed HHH, same letter 3 times, easy to remember, easy to type, and watched the lampboard illuminate 3 different letters. He typed HHH again, recorded the second set of illuminated letters, then reset the rotors to HHH and began encoding Hartmann's position report. Grid reference, fuel status, provisions, torpedo inventory. The routine information that kept U-boat command informed of their Wolfpack status. The encoded message went out over the airwaves at 02 hours, racing toward Germany at the speed of light. It was also intercepted by a Royal Navy Y station in Scotland, transcribed by a WAF operator who couldn't understand a single letter, but who noted the frequency, time, and call signs with practiced precision. By 0600 hours, the intercept was at Bletchley Park. By 0730, a cryptanalyst in Hut 8, the section dedicated to German naval Enigma, separate from Hut 6's work on Army and Air Force traffic, had identified the message key as HHH. By 1100 hours, this crib had been combined with others from the same U-boat network, fed into one of the bomb machines that were now operational and proving devastatingly effective. By 1400 hours, November 16th's U-boat Enigma settings were broken. By 1700 hours, U-6864's position report had been decrypted and translated, along with position reports from 11 other U-boats operating in the North Atlantic. The information went immediately to the Admiralty's submarine tracking room, where Royal Navy intelligence officers maintained a massive wall chart showing estimated positions of every German U-boat at sea. At 1830 hours, convoy HX-2117, 38 merchant ships carrying supplies from New York to Liverpool, received new routing instructions via encrypted signal. Instead of following their original course, which would have taken them directly through the Wolfpack positions revealed by the decrypted Enigma messages, they altered course 40 degrees north. The convoy commodore wasn't told why the route had changed. He didn't need to know. He simply followed orders, and his ships steamed through empty ocean while German submarines waited 150 miles to the south, wondering why no targets appeared. Werner Hartmann never learned that his position report had been read by the enemy. He never knew that the convoy he'd been positioned to intercept had been routed around him. He never knew that Obergefreiter Schmidt's lazy choice of HHH as a message key had contributed to the decryption that kept those merchant ships safe. U-664 spent 3 more days on patrol, sighted nothing, and returned to base in France with all torpedoes still loaded. Mission failure. Just another day in the increasingly difficult Battle of the Atlantic. But Schmidt's Cillies, and thousands like it, were having an impact far beyond individual failed patrols. In London, the Admiralty's statistics told the story that individual submarine commanders couldn't see. Merchant ship losses in the North Atlantic had been catastrophic through 1941 and early 1942, with U-boats sinking vessels faster than the Allies could replace them. Then, gradually, the calculus shifted. Convoys began avoiding wolf-pack positions with suspicious regularity. Submarines found themselves patrolling empty ocean. Resupply submarines were intercepted and destroyed with timing that seemed impossibly lucky. The Germans suspected intelligence leaks. They investigated whether spies had infiltrated U-boat command. They considered whether high-level naval codes had been compromised. But they never seriously considered that Enigma itself had been broken. The mathematics were too complex, the number of possible settings too vast. Their own cryptographic experts had assured them that breaking Enigma without capturing a machine and current settings was effectively impossible. What they failed to account for was human nature. The tired radio operator choosing his girlfriend's initials instead of random letters. The lazy officer using ABC because it was quick and easy. The stressed submariner repeating the same key he'd used yesterday because generating true randomness required mental energy he didn't have after 60 days at sea. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, would later write in his memoirs about the inexplicable Allied ability to route convoys away from his submarines. He attributed it to advanced radar, to long-range aircraft, to improved anti-submarine tactics. He never fully understood that his submariners' messages, encrypted with the unbreakable Enigma machine, were being read in near real time by cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, who exploited every operator shortcut, every predictable pattern, every Cillies. By the war's end, historians would estimate that Enigma decryption shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by years, saving hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping and countless lives. The victory came not from a single brilliant breakthrough, but from the systematic exploitation of accumulated human weaknesses, from patient cataloguing of operator patterns, from the unglamorous work of testing message keys against indexes of predictable choices. 3 letters. Chosen because random was difficult and HHH was easy, contributing to a strategic intelligence advantage that helped turn the tide of the war. The cost of confidence in an unbreakable machine. The price of underestimating the laziness of tired men. Victory through weakness. Bletchley Park, May 8, 1945. 14:20 hours. The celebration in Hut 6 was subdued, marked more by exhausted relief than jubilation. Outside, across Britain and Europe, millions celebrated victory in Europe Day, with parades and parties and the profound release of 6 years of tension. Inside the wooden hut, cryptanalysts continued working through the day's intercepts, maintained their card indexes, updated their Cillies catalogues. The war in the Pacific continued. The work wasn't finished. Gordon Welchman stood by the window, looking out at the grounds of Bletchley Park, where spring flowers bloomed indifferent to history. Behind him, the room hummed with its familiar rhythms. Typewriters, voices, the shuffle of paper, the mechanical sounds of Typex machines processing decrypted messages for transmission to intelligence consumers. 5 years, hundreds of thousands of intercepted messages, millions of man-hours spent exploiting the systematic weaknesses in what the Germans had believed was an unbreakable code. Thinking about the counterfactual, Sarah Watkins asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of tea. She'd been one of the early recruits to Hut 6, had spent 5 years identifying Cillies, building indexes, training new analysts in the patient work of recognizing human patterns within encrypted chaos. Always, Welchman replied, accepting the tea. If the Germans had enforced truly random message key selection, if they disciplined or removed operators who used predictable keys, if they'd recognized that human weakness, not mathematical weakness, was compromising their cipher, would we have broken it anyway? Welchman considered. Eventually, the bomb machines gave us the computational power to test settings systematically. We developed other techniques, the Herival tip, traffic analysis, captured materials. But Cillies were crucial, especially in 1940 and 1941, before we had the full Bombay network operational. They gave us the initial footholds we needed. He paused, sipping his tea. And even after we had better methods, Cillies remained useful. They accelerated the process, confirmed hypotheses, provided cribs that made everything else easier. An Enigma machine operated by a disciplined, well-trained operator who genuinely chose random message keys would have been exponentially harder to break. But they were human, Sarah said. Tired, stressed, bored humans doing repetitive tasks under difficult conditions. Of course they took shortcuts. That's the lesson, isn't it? Welchman turned from the window. The Germans built an incredibly sophisticated machine. The mathematics was sound, the engineering was excellent. But they forgot that the machine would be operated by people, and people are the weakest link in any security system. Not because they're stupid or incompetent, but because they're human. Across the room, Mavis Beatty, now Mavis Lever Beatty after marrying fellow cryptanalyst Keith Beatty in 1942, was organizing files for archival. She'd moved from Dilly Knox's research section to work on Abwehr Enigma, had been instrumental in breaking the German intelligence service's supposedly unbreakable cipher variant. Knox himself had died in 1943, his last years consumed by the cryptanalytic obsession that had defined his career. His final words to Mavis and the team had been about the human element, the need to think like the enemy, to understand not just the mathematics of codes, but the psychology of the people using them. The statistics were still classified, would remain classified for decades, but everyone in Hut 6 knew the rough magnitudes, tens of thousands of German messages decrypted, U-boat positions revealed, allowing convoys to be routed to safety. Wehrmacht movement orders read, informing Allied counter-strategies, Luftwaffe operations exposed, enabling defensive preparations. Intelligence that had shortened campaigns, saved lives, tilted the strategic balance in battles from the Atlantic to North Africa to the Eastern Front. And while Enigma decryption had relied on many techniques, captured materials, traffic analysis, the Herival tip, the bomb machines, the brilliant work of Alan Turing, and dozens of other mathematicians, the humble Cillie had been there from the beginning. The predictable message key, the lazy shortcut, the human weakness in the machine. Werner Richter, who typed his fiancée Cillies' initials in May 1940, survived the war. He returned to Hamburg, married Cillie, worked as a postal clerk for 30 years. He never knew that his tired choice of CIL had contributed to breaking the day's Enigma settings, that it had entered the catalogue of predictable patterns that British cryptanalysts tested against thousands of messages. He never knew that the term Cillie had been coined because of an operator like him, that his human moment of weakness had become part of the hidden history of the war. Paul Schmidt, radio operator on U-6064, didn't survive. His submarine was sunk in August 1943 by a Royal Navy destroyer that had been vectored to the area based on decrypted Enigma messages. Schmidt went down with the boat, never knowing that his repeated use of HHH as a message key had helped Bletchley Park maintain its access to U-boat communications. Just another casualty of a war where invisible victories and defeats occurred in the cryptographic realm long before ships and submarines met in combat. The story wouldn't become public for decades. The British government kept Ultra, the code word for Enigma-derived intelligence, classified until the 1970s. When the secret finally emerged, historians re-evaluated the entire war, recognizing the crucial role that cryptanalysis had played in Allied victory. Books were written, films were made, the bomb machines and the brilliant mathematicians became famous. But the Cillies, the lazy shortcuts, the predictable patterns, the human weaknesses remained footnotes in the technical literature, catalogued in classified reports, acknowledged by the cryptanalysts who'd built their indexes and tested their hypotheses, but largely forgotten by the popular histories that preferred dramatic breakthroughs to patient exploitation of accumulated operator errors. Yet they mattered. In 1940, when Britain stood alone, in 1941, when U-boats nearly starved the island, in 1942, when every tactical advantage meant survival, in 1943 and 1944, when planning the invasion of Europe required knowing German defensive positions. The Cillies mattered because they were consistent, because tired humans kept making the same mistakes, because generating true randomness is difficult and predictable patterns are easy. The Germans thought they'd built an unbreakable code. They'd been right about the mathematics, they'd been wrong about the humans. And in that miscalculation, in that failure to account for tired operators choosing girlfriends' initials instead of random letters, lay one of the invisible turning points of the Second World War. Victory through weakness. Not through the enemy's weakness in battle, but through their confidence in a machine that was only as secure as the fallible humans who operated it. 3 letters, chosen carelessly by thousands of operators across 6 years of war, catalogued patiently by cryptanalysts in wooden huts in the English countryside, transformed into the intelligence advantage that helped win the war. The unbreakable code, broken by human nature.